much for that very kind introduction. It's a great pleasure to be here. I'm going to talk quite a lot about my experiences in Gaza. I'm not going to apologise for anything I'm going to say. I will give a health warning, because some of it and some of what I've seen, some of my experiences, it's really quite brutal hearing about it. But I feel that having witnessed so much of the genocide and so many war crimes in my multiple trips to Gaza in the last 2 years, I feel an absolute duty to share in every detail what I've seen, because you're not hearing it from anyone else. Now, I don't know if any of you have seen the World Press Photography Competition. That picture on the left there, those of you can see, won first prize in the 2024 competition, and that's a picture of a lady holding her dead niece in a place called Jabalia, just outside Gaza City, a refugee camp there. And on the right is a picture of an 11-year-old boy. This won first prize this year, or 2025. And as you can see, he's lost both of his arms. There's more than 4,000 children who are now amputees in Gaza. Many of them one limb, some of them two, some of them even 3 limbs have been lost. You'll be aware that on, I think it was 16th of September last year, the United Nations Commission announced the findings that they had agreed genocide had been carried out in Gaza over the last 2 years. Something we've all known, something our government has still refused to acknowledge, something our media has still refused to acknowledge. Now, I've been going out to Gaza since 2010, teaching medical students, working and helping to develop cancer services. And this is a photograph from our trip in, I think, 2019. They were making wonderful strides forward in their cancer services. They'd embraced the concept of specialisation, they'd embraced the concept of multidisciplinary working, and they'd built a standalone cancer hospital. You can see that over there in the bottom right-hand corner, the Turkish Cancer Hospital. And I was there, working there in May 2023 doing some cancer surgery. And I cannot overstate how important that was for the healthcare services in Gaza, developing a standalone cancer hospital just for the treatment of cancer. And this is what happened to it last year. So that is the Turkish cancer hospital being completely destroyed last year. And as I said, every hospital, all 36 hospitals, have been attacked in Gaza. And the main theme of my talk is going to be the deliberate destruction of the healthcare system, the deliberate targeting of hospitals, the deliberate targeting of healthcare workers, much of which I have witnessed with my own eyes, all of which, of course, are war crimes. I'm not going to give you too many statistics, but the bare facts are, this is from the United Nations official website just a week or two ago. I think they said then 71,000 people have been killed by the military assault in Gaza. We know that is a gross underestimate. We know there are many thousands of people whose bodies have still not been discovered, who are buried under the rubble, including friends of people in the audience, certainly friends of mine, whose bodies have not been discovered. So we know there are many, many more than that. We know that more than 1,700 healthcare workers have been killed in Gaza in the last 2 years. We know that more than 450 healthcare workers have been abducted, have been illegally detained, and many of them tortured and killed, including, again, friends of mine. Every single hospital has been targeted. None of the hospitals in Gaza are fully functional. The United Nations tells us that 18 hospitals are working at the moment, partly functional, but a partly functioning hospital in Gaza may mean nothing much more than the ability to apply field dressings. There's probably only one hospital, which is Nasser Hospital, where I was most recently working, only one hospital functioning at the level where they can deal properly with major trauma. What about the children? Well, this graph on the left was first produced, it was November 2023. Nearly 25,000 children have been killed in Gaza in the last 2 years. When that graph was first drawn, at that point there were 136 supposed ceasefire until October 2025, I worked out the average number of children being killed per day was about 35. 35 children every single day in Gaza for 2 years. The equivalent number in Ukraine, which is the other war we hear a lot about, the equivalent number in Ukraine is 0.7. In Syria 2, in Iraq 0.6. 30 to 35 children in Gaza compared to 0.7 in Ukraine. There are more children who've been killed in Gaza in the last 2 years than in all the conflicts around the world put together over the last 5 years. An astonishing figure. Over 40,000 children have lost one or both parents. And there's an acronym that all of us who've worked in Gaza have used, WCNSF, Wounded Child, No Surviving Family. These are labels we had to give to children because we didn't know their names, because they were the only surviving people. This is a typical scene from an operating theatre, and this is taken from Al-Aqsa Hospital in Deir al-Balah, where I've worked on 2 trips out there. These patients are coming in predominantly from explosive injuries in my first few trips. My last trip I saw a lot of gunshot wounds, and I'll come on to that later, but appalling injuries from these fragmentation bombs, which is the most commonly used bombs used out there. These are missiles which are designed for the maximum amount of tissue destruction for a human body. Each bomb contains many thousands of very small metal fragments, which then tear through all the different internal organs, killing everyone within a several hundred meters radius. We only get to operate on those that are more than half a kilometre away, because everyone else nearer than that gets killed. This is a typical scene in the emergency rooms at Al-Aqsa Hospital and Nasser Hospital. It's a combination of 2 photos from each ER that I worked in over the last 2 years. And you can see the mass casualties, the patients being treated on the ground, the blood on the floor, the huge numbers of traumas, appalling scenes. We saw this every day with mass casualties coming in, frequently overwhelming the capacity of the hospital. This was a day in Al-Aqsa Hospital which I will never forget this day. It's imprinted on my mind. This was in January 2024. I've been out there, we'd gone in, we were the very first emergency team that went into Gaza after October the 7th. And it was a terrible day in the ER. There were multiple mass casualties. I was operating, I went down to help with one, and it was chaos. There were dead bodies outside the emergency room. The floor of the ER was covered in critically injured patients. And the first thing I saw was this little boy lying on the ground. I found out later his parents had been killed by the bomb that blew him up. And the first thing I saw was this little boy, bundled in rags. He'd been abandoned. No one had triaged him. No one had seen him. And he had a big hole in the side of his chest. So I picked him up and I took him into the resuscitation room. In that picture, that you can see me at the top end of the picture, was resuscitating him. On the ground, you can see a little boy with a bandage around his head. He had actually been on that trolley when we went into the resuscitation room. There was only one trolley in there because most people were being treated on the ground. We had to pick him up and put him on the ground so we could try and save the life of this 6-year-old boy. The boy with the bandage around his head had been admitted 3 hours previously. He'd come in from a severe explosive injury. He had suffered an appalling, non-survivable brain injury. His brain was exposed. He was never going to survive anywhere in the world. And he was dying, but he was being very slow to die. And there was nowhere for him to go and die peacefully. He was lying on the floor, still breathing, slowly dying, while we treated other children around him. At the bottom of the picture is Aya, who was the sister of the boy we were treating on that trolley. She didn't have life-threatening injuries. She had a badly broken leg. But her leg was so badly broken, the bone was bent and it had cut off the blood supply to her foot. So that bone had to be straightened as an emergency before she could have surgery in order to restore the blood supply to her foot. Now this was a day in Al-Aqsa Hospital, like nearly every other day we had there. this was the day when we had completely run out of all painkillers. We had no pain relief, no painkillers to give any of our patients. So this little girl, little Aya, 8 years of age, had to have her leg straightened by one of the junior doctors there with no pain relief at all. And I can still, every time I tell this story, I can hear her screams as her leg was straightened back into its normal position. This was a very typical day in the ER. Let me tell you about Asil. She was a lady I operated on. She suffered a severe explosive injury. It killed one of her daughters. It injured the other daughter. She came in, we operated on her as an emergency, saved her life, and the next day she was conscious and we were talking to her. And she told me how her dead daughter, she had been blown up, and Asil went to pick her daughter up in several different pieces in order to say goodbye to her before she was taken to the hospital. I'm telling you these stories. There are many, many stories like this, and we've witnessed the most appalling atrocities being perpetrated predominantly on women and children. So this is a paper we've had published recently, and I won't bore you with the details of it, other than to say it describes the pattern of injuries that we surgeons and emergency doctors have seen in Gaza. And we've described a pattern of injuries from shrapnel, from bombs, from gunshot wounds, which have never been described in a civilian population before. The patterns of injury were typical of the multiple use of high-energy missiles designed to cause the most appalling tissue damage. And it's a pattern of injuries that's only previously been seen in war combatants, i.e. soldiers fighting soldiers. This is the first time this pattern of injuries has been shown in the civilian population. And again, it provides yet more evidence, in our view, that this is a deliberate targeting of civilian populations in Gaza, which of course has been denied, but we have seen it with our own eyes. So the healthcare system has been completely destroyed. There's been no electricity in Gaza for over 2 years. All the hospitals are reliant upon their own supplies of fuel. If the fuel runs out, there's no power for the ventilators. If the ventilators can't be powered, patients on the ventilators die. If there's no fuel, there's no power for the incubators. So those newborn babies in incubators, when the fuel runs out, they die. And you may remember the story from 18 months ago from Al-Nasser Pediatric Hospital in Gaza City, when the Israeli ground forces invaded the hospital, displaced all the local staff, and they said to the Israeli soldiers as they went out, there are 6 newborn babies in incubators. What's going to happen to them? They were ignored, of course. When they went back into the hospital 2 weeks later, when the ground forces left, they went to the neonatal unit, and those 6 babies were still there. They died 2 weeks ago. Their bodies were lying there rotting, having been abandoned by the Israeli military. And there were many, many examples like that. No drugs, no painkillers. I had 1 2-week period when we had no sterile drapes for the operating theatre. So we had to make our own sort of sterile drapes, trying to keep the field sterile. We often ran out of surgical gloves, so we had to wash our gloves between operations. There was often no water, so all we could use was alcohol gel to scrub up. Appalling conditions. The hospitals have been targeted. But again, the hospitals haven't just been bombed. They've been systematically dismantled. At Shifa Hospital, the Israeli soldiers went in there. They went into each laboratory, destroyed all the equipment that were used to do the blood tests. They went to the radiology, the scanning departments. They destroyed the scanners. They cut off the cables of the portable ultrasound scanners to make sure they could never be used again. They destroyed the water supplies. They destroyed the sewage supplies. Sorry, wrong picture. They went and destroyed every every single dialysis machine, every machine that treats kidney failure. That Shifa Hospital on the left, how it used to be, a place I've worked on many occasions, that's what it looked like a year ago when it had been destroyed by the drill. In the top there is a picture of NASA Hospital, and you can see the 4th floor has been bombed there. That was on August the 25th last year, just after I left NASA Hospital. And they bombed a clinical area where there was an intensive care unit, where there were doctors living, where there was a theatre space. And on the right you can see me with some of the medical students I'd been teaching a few weeks previously. Half of those medical students who I had taught just before then were killed by that bomb that had blown up NASA Hospital. They weren't targeting Hamas militants, they were targeting, and they've done this repeatedly, they were targeting clinical areas in the hospital. When Shifa Hospital was invaded by the Israeli military, all the medical staff were displaced. When they went back in after the Israeli military had left, they found 300 bodies of patients and staff who'd been executed. Most of them had their hands handcuffed behind their back. These two, Ahmed Mahatma, a young plastic surgeon I knew, his mother, their bodies were discovered just outside Shifa Hospital, naked, blindfolded, hands handcuffed behind their back, both with bullet wounds in their head. They had clearly been executed. This wasn't collateral damage. They had been executed. You may have seen the film that was eventually shown on Channel 4 called Gaza Medics Under Fire. It was commissioned by the BBC, but of course the BBC were too cowardly to show it in the end, so Channel 4 showed it. And it was a brilliant but harrowing film. If you haven't seen it, you can see it on Channel 4 Catch-Up or whatever it's called. It's still there. And it's based on a publication which you can Google and see called Healthcare Workers Watch, which was a brilliant bit of investigative work detailing the testimonies of hundreds of healthcare workers who were killed and those that were tortured, having been abducted as well. And they describe in great detail the systematic torture and abuse of Palestinian detainees, multiple examples of direct injuries being inflicted on male genitalia repeatedly, and I've taken some of these testimonies myself, audio, video, and given them to the international courts as evidence. And particularly harrowing for me as a doctor, clear evidence of not only medical neglect and negligence, but clear evidence of Israeli healthcare workers in the prisons taking part in that torture, torturing people in the prisons. This is one of the men who was killed, an iconic orthopedic surgeon called Dr. Adnan Al-Bursh. Many of you may have known his name. A wonderful man who I knew who worked at Shifa Hospital. And shortly before he was abducted, he was interviewed, said that practicing medicine in Gaza has become a crime. And the penalty for saving people's lives has become detention and being tortured to death. Shortly after he said that, he was abducted and he was incarcerated in an Israeli prison. And he was killed under torture in that prison. And a Sky investigative journalist interviewed fellow detainees in that hospital, even interviewed some Israeli prison guards. And Adnan al-Bursh's mode of torture for the 2 weeks prior to being killed was being raped every single day by the Israeli prison service. And I won't read this out because it's too harrowing, but if you want to look at that document online, you can Google Healthcare Workers Watch, and it describes in detail all the different forms of torture that have been used on Palestinian detainees in the Israeli prisons. This is what Gaza looks like now. You've seen these photos. The whole country has been destroyed, particularly the north. Widespread devastation. And of course there's a famine. And that's the strong narrative of my most recent trip to Gaza this summer, last summer, when I saw the most appalling effects of malnutrition. And of course this is a man-made famine. Of course this is called by the deliberate blockade by the Israeli military, stopping any food and nutrition and other aid going into Gaza. And it was over 18 months ago that a United Nations official said that starvation was being used as a weapon of war. And of course that is the basis upon which the International Criminal Court laid their initial charges against Netanyahu and Gallant, that the fact they were using starvation as a method of war, as a weapon of war. And it's led to many people dying. This is Lama, whose family gave me permission to use this photo after she had died. And I had two young ladies, two young teenage girls, a year and a half ago, who died under my care. I'd operated on both. Tala, who was 16, Lama, who was 18. They both had severe explosive injuries from bombs. They both would have survived them. They both would have had a greater than 95% chance of surviving had they not been profoundly malnourished when they came in, and had we not been working in a place where we had no nutrition to give them. They both died under my care. They both died preventable deaths. They both died because the Israeli military had stopped food and nutritional support coming into Gaza. This is the single most upsetting case I've been involved in my whole medical career, both in the UK and in Gaza. Habiba was an 11-year-old girl who was the victim of a bomb explosion that killed other members of her family. She came in, she had severe chest injuries and severe injuries to her esophagus, which is what I do. I operate on the esophagus. I spent the whole of one night operating on her at Nasser Hospital just a few months ago in July. And the operation went well. I managed to reconstruct her esophagus. She was getting better. But we had no nutrition to give her. And she died 4 weeks later. She died after I got back to Oxford. She died because of the Israeli blockade, because there was no nutrition to give her. An entirely preventable death. Little Zainab, 7 months of age. She died of starvation. She's got a tube going down her nose there. Her mother was so malnourished, she'd never been able to produce any breast milk. She needed formula feed, but there was no formula feed in Nasser Hospital. And she died 2 weeks into my last stay there. And what made it worse was not only was there no formula feed, and she died of it, but 4 days before she died, 4 American doctors came into Gaza to work with us. They knew there was a shortage of formula feed, and they'd packed their bags with cartons of formula feed to give to babies like Zainab to feed her. And at the border between Gaza and Israel, their luggage was searched, and every single carton, every single container of formula feed was removed by the Israeli military. They didn't take anything else, they just took the formula feed. That feed, which could have saved Zainab's life, everything was taken, and she died, nothing else other than starvation. She was starved to death because of the Israeli blockade. The final thing I'm going to talk to you about is the obscenely named Gaza Humanitarian Foundation. This was the strong narrative from my most recent trip, when we saw lots of young teenage boys who were shot at the food distribution points. This is an organisation set up as a collaboration between the US and the Israeli governments to distribute food when they banned UNRWA from distributing food. But of course they were set up as death traps, and there were many, many young teenage boys who had been sent there by their families to get food, who were then shot by the Israeli soldiers. This is a young man who, and the top in the middle, who was shot in the liver, he survived. The bottom, this is a man who was shot, that's the kidney I removed, which has been shattered by that bullet, which I removed from his You can see in the top right many dead bodies lying out on the ground, young teenage boys as young as 10, 11, 12, who've been shot deliberately. And what was particularly bad was not only were they being shot and killed, but we noticed a very, very clear clustering of injuries. So that on one day we had 19 young teenage boys who came in, all of whom had been shot in the head and neck. Nowhere else, just the head and neck. Another day they came in having been shot in the chest. Another day they came in having been shot in the abdomen. On one day, on the Saturday before I left, 4 of them came in having been shot entirely in the testicles, nowhere else. And this was very clear. The clustering, the pattern of injuries was so striking that it was beyond coincidence, and it seemed to us this was a game of target practice being played. One day they shoot the head, the next day they're going to shoot in the chest, the next day in the arms, and on Saturday night we'll go for the testicles. They shot women as well. This was a young lady called Shina, a 26-year-old, who was shot by a quadcopter. When those young teenage boys were being shot at the GHF site, in the tents nearby there were quadcopters shooting indiscriminately at all the tents, trying to kill everyone inside the tents. Shina, at that time, was 3 months pregnant. She was shot. That's the bullet I removed from her abdomen. Luckily, it missed the uterus. The baby survived, but she lost 2 or 3 feet of her bowel. Again, she was just resting in the tent. So I mentioned that figure of 71,000, and I said that was a gross underestimate. That doesn't take into account the excess deaths. The deaths from cancer, from heart disease, from kidney disease, from liver disease, from infectious diseases, those diseases that haven't been treated because of the blockade, the excess deaths. The Lancet, about a year ago, reckoned it was about 186,000. They upgraded that last December to 220,000. They now feel, the latest estimate is that more than 350,000 people have died from excess deaths. That is 15% of the population of Gaza, which we believe has been killed by this Israeli military assault. And that figure was from 4 or 5 months ago, so it may well be approaching 500,000 now. So Gaza has been failed. We know it's been failed by our government, by other governments around the world. We know it's been failed by our media, which is why it's so important that people like us share what we have seen so everyone knows what's going on. But it's been failed by our medical institutions, by our medical colleges, by our medical associations. And I believe, as I'm sure all of you will agree, that all medical professionals, all institutions have a fundamental ethical obligation to uphold human rights, to protect lives and condemn acts of violence. And the Lancet, just about 2 months ago, this was on the front page of the Lancet, where they said that most medical and surgical societies worldwide have remained silent. And staying silent whilst pretending to be neutral is, in effect, a form of complicity. So, we can all do something. This isn't a ceasefire. The amount of violence is reduced, but since October the 10th, when the so-called ceasefire happened, and since when our government has been silent, since when our press hasn't talked about it at all, more than 500 Gazans have been killed by Israeli soldiers. More than 100 children have been killed since the ceasefire. We know that multiple babies have died of hypothermia. I think the last count is 20 have died of hypothermia during the appalling weather conditions. Less than 50% of the aid trucks that were promised to go in as part of this deal have gone in. And there's an acute shortage of blankets, mattresses, and more than 95% of the tents that they're living in are uninhabitable now because of the terrible weather conditions they have there. So I'm going to finish up by just saluting and talking about some of the magnificent people I've managed to work with out there. We've seen the absolute depths of humanity over the last 2 years. We've seen appalling evil being carried out in Gaza. I've seen with my own eyes multiple war crimes, multiple children have been murdered, women as well. But I've also had the privilege of working with some truly inspirational people, and I've also seen the absolute best of humanity. And these are Palestinians, Gazans living in Gaza, working day in, day night for over 2 years. Yasser on the top right there, Mahmoud, Mohammed, they haven't been able to get out of Gaza. They put their lives on the line every single minute of every single day to allow some of us to go there and work. So these are the true heroes who are still there and still working very hard. Thank you very much indeed for listening.